about how I learned to anticipate the future by studying the past. Monday evening, August 15th, President Nixon went on television to tell the world that the U.S. was breaking its promise to let people exchange their dollars for gold. I expected the stock market to plunge the next day, so I got on the exchange floor early to prepare. When the opening bell rang, pandemonium broke out, but not the kind I expected. The market was up, way up, and went on to rise nearly 25%. That surprised me, because I never experienced a currency devaluation before. When I dug into history, I discovered that the exact same thing happened in 1933 and had the exact. Then paper dollars were also linked to gold, which the U.S. was running out of because it was spending more paper money checks than it had gold to exchange for them. And President Roosevelt announced on the radio that he would break the country's promise to exchange dollars for gold.
This law also gave authority to develop a program.
In both cases, breaking the link to gold allowed the U.S. to continue spending more than it earned, simply by printing more paper dollars. Since there was an increase in the number of dollars without an increase in the country's wealth, the value of each dollar fell. As these new dollars entered the market, without a corresponding increase in productivity, they went to buy lots of stocks, gold, and commodities, and hence caused their prices to rise. As I studied more history, I saw that the exact same thing happened many, many times before. I saw that since the beginning of time, when governments spent much more than they took in taxes, and conditions got bad, they ran out of money and they needed more. So they printed more, a lot more, which made its value fall and made the prices of most everything, including stocks, gold, and commodities, rise. That's when I first learned the principle that when central banks print a lot of money to relieve a crisis, buy stocks, gold, and commodities because their value will rise and the value of paper money will fall. This printing of money is also what happened in 2008 to relieve the mortgage-driven debt crisis, and in 2020 to relieve the pandemic-driven economic crisis, and it almost certainly will happen in the future. So I suggest that you keep this principle in mind. These experiences gave me another principle, which is to understand what is coming at you, you need to understand what happened before you. That principle led me to study how the Roaring '20s bubble turned into the 1930s depression, which gave me the lessons that allowed me to anticipate and profit from the 2007 bubble, turning into the 2008 bust. All these experiences, an almost instinctual urge to look to the past for similar situations, to learn how to handle the future well. Orders. Over the last few years, three big things that hadn't happened in my lifetime prompted me to do this study. First, countries didn't have enough money to pay their debts, even after lowering interest rates to zero, so their central banks began printing lots of money to do so. Second, big internal conflicts emerged due to growing gaps in wealth and values. This showed up in political populism and polarization between the left, who want to redistribute wealth, and the right, who want to defend those holding the wealth. And third, increasing external conflict between a rising great power and the leading great power, as is now happening with China and the United States. Back. I saw that all these had happened together before, many times, and nearly always led to changing domestic and world orders.
Current world order, commonly called the American world order, formed after the Allied victory in World War II, when the U.S. emerged as the dominant world power. It was set out in agreements and treaties for how monetary systems worked. In 1944, the New World Monetary System was laid out in the Bretton Woods Agreement and established the dollar as the world's leading reserve currency. A reserve currency is a currency that is commonly accepted around the world, and having one is a key factor in a country becoming the richest and most powerful empire. With a new dominant power and monetary system established, a new world order begins. These changes take place in a timeless and universal cycle that I call the Big Cycle.
Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the four most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again. And like human life cycles, no two are exactly the same, but most are similar. They're driven by logical cause and effect relationships that progress through stages from birth to strength and maturity to weakness and inevitably decline. However, that's like saying a person's life cycle takes 80 years on average without recognizing that many are much shorter and many are longer. While age can be a good indicator of future longevity, a better way is to look at health indicators. One can do that with empires and their vital signs too. I found that by watching the indicators of power change, I was able to see what stage a country was in, which helped me to anticipate what was likely to come next. Now, I'll take you through the big cycle in more detail. Give me 20 minutes and I'll give you the last 500 years of history and show you the similar patterns across the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese empires. You can see this happening now as the US and China are roughly comparable in both their economic outputs and their shares of world trade. As countries trade more globally, they must protect their trade routes and their foreign interests from attack, so they develop great military strength. If done well, this virtuous cycle leads to strong income growth, which can be used to finance investments in education, infrastructure, and research and development. They must also develop systems to incentivize and empower those that have the ability to make or take wealth. In all of these cases, the most successful empires used a capitalist approach to develop productive entrepreneurs. Even China, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party, used a form of this capitalist approach. Deng Xiaoping, when asked about this, said, "It doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat as long as it catches mice. And it's glorious to be rich." To do this well, they must develop their capital markets. Most importantly, their lending, bond, and stock markets. That allows people to convert their savings into investments to fund invention and development and share in the successes of those who make great things happen. The Dutch created the first publicly listed company, the Dutch East India Company, and the first stock market to fund it, which were integral parts of the system that produced massive wealth and power. As a natural consequence, the greatest empires developed the world's leading financial centers for attracting and distributing the world's capital. Amsterdam was the world's financial center when the Dutch were preeminent. London, when the British were on top. New York is now, and China is quickly developing its financial centers. Most importantly, the capitalists, the governments, and the military must work together. Not only did the Dutch work well together, they were one and the same. The Dutch East India Company was granted a trade monopoly from the government and had its own officially sanctioned military to go out into the global markets to make and take wealth. The British followed with the British East India Company and had a similar coordination of their government, business, and military operations. The U.S. military-industrial complex followed suit, as does the Chinese system today. As the country becomes the largest international trading empire, its transactions can be paid with its currency, making it the preferred global medium of exchange. And because their currency is so widely accepted and frequently used, people around the world want to save in it, making it the preferred storehold of wealth, and thus the world's leading reserve currency. The guilder was the world's main reserve currency when the Dutch led world trade, the pound was when the British led, and the dollar has been since the US led. Naturally, China's currency is increasingly being used as a reserve currency. Having a reserve currency enables the empire to borrow more than other countries. Advantage is huge. Think about it. People all over the world are eager to save and hence lend back their currency to the empire. Countries without a reserve currency don't have that. And when the empire runs out of its own money, remember the United States in 1971? They can always print more. The exorbitant privilege afforded by the empire's reserve currency leads borrowing to increase and the beginning of a financial bubble. This series of cause and effect relationships leading to mutually supportive financial, political, and military powers, bolstered by the borrowing power of a reserve currency, have gone together since history began to be recorded. All the empires that became the most powerful in the world followed this path to the top. While in the top phase, most of these strengths are sustained, embedded within the fruits of their success are the seeds of their decline. As a rule, as people in these rich and powerful countries earn more, that makes them more expensive and less competitive relative to people in other countries who are willing to work for less. At the same time, people in other countries naturally copy the methods and technologies of the leading power, which further reduces the leading power's competitiveness. For example, British shipbuilders had less expensive workers than Dutch shipbuilders. So they hired Dutch designers to design better ships that were built by less expensive British workers, making them more competitive, which led the British to rise and the Dutch to decline. Also, as people become richer, they tend not to work as hard. They enjoy more leisure, pursue the finer and less productive things in life, and at the extreme become decadent. Values change from generation to generation during the rise to the top, from those who had to fight to achieve wealth and power to those who inherited it. They're less battle-hardened, steeped in luxuries, and accustomed to the easy life, which makes them more vulnerable to challenge. As people get used to doing well, they increasingly bet on the good times continuing and borrow money to do that, which grows into financial bubbles. Naturally, the financial gains come unevenly, so the wealth gap grows. Wealth gaps are self-reinforcing because rich people use their greater resources to reinforce their powers. For example, they give greater privileges to their children, like better education, and they influence the political system to their advantage. This causes the gaps in values, politics, and opportunities to grow between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Those who are less well-off feel the system is unfair, so resentments grow. But as long as the living standards of most people are still rising, these gaps and resentments don't boil over into conflict. Having the world's reserve currency inevitably leads to borrowing excessively and contributes to the country building up large debts with foreign lenders. While this boosts spending power over the short term, it weakens the country's financial health and weakens the currency over the long term. In other words, when borrowing and spending are strong, the empire appears very strong, but its finances are in fact being weakened. The borrowing sustains the country's power beyond its fundamentals by financing both domestic overconsumption and international military conflicts required to maintain the empire. Inevitably, the cost of maintaining and defending the empire becomes greater than the revenue it brings in, so having an empire becomes unprofitable. For example, the Dutch Empire overextended around the world and fought war after increasingly expensive war with the British and other European powers to protect its territory and trade routes. The British Empire similarly became massive, bureaucratic, and lost its competitive advantages as rival powers, particularly Germany, soared, leading to an increasingly expensive arms race, and the U.S. has spent about $8 trillion on foreign wars and their consequences since September 11th. And trillions more for other military operations and for supporting military bases in 70 countries. And it still isn't spending enough to support its military competition with China in the area around China. In this cycle, the richer countries eventually get deeper into debt by borrowing from poorer countries that save more. It's one of the early signs of a wealth and power shift. This started in the United States in the 1980s when it had a per capita income 40 times that of China's and started borrowing from Chinese who wanted to save in dollars because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. Similarly, the British borrowed a lot of money from its much poorer colonies, and the Dutch did the same at their time. If the empire begins to run out of it, those holding their currency begin to look to sell and get out rather than to buy, save, lend, and get in. And the strength of the empire begins to decline. The decline. The decline comes from internal economic weakness together with internal fighting or costly external fighting or both. Typically, the decline comes gradually and then very suddenly. When debts become very large and there is an economic downturn and the empire can no longer borrow the money necessary to repay its debts, the financial bubble bursts. This creates great domestic hardships and forces the country to choose between defaulting on its debts or printing a lot of new money. It always chooses to print a lot of new money. At first gradually, and eventually massively. That devalues the currency and raises inflation. For the Dutch, this was the financial crisis brought about by financial excesses and paying for the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Similarly, for the British, it was paying for its financial excesses and its debts from the two world wars. And for the U.S., it's been 3 cycles of debt finance booms and busts since the 90s, with the central bank stepping in each time with stronger measures. When the government has problems funding itself, when there are bad economic conditions, and living standards for most people are declining, and there are large wealth, values, and political gaps, internal conflict between the rich and the poor, as well as different ethnic, religious, and racial groups, greatly increases. This leads to political extremism that shows up as populism of the left or the right. Those of the left seek to redistribute the wealth, while those of the right seek to maintain the wealth in the hands of the rich. Typically, during such times, taxes on the rich rise, and when the rich fear their wealth and well-being will be taken away, they move to places, assets, and currencies they feel safer in. These outflows reduce the empire's tax revenue, which leads to a classic, self-reinforcing, hollowing out problem. When the flight of wealth gets bad enough, governments outlaw it. Those seeking to get out begin to panic. These turbulent conditions undermine productivity, which shrinks the economic pie and causes more conflict about how to divide the shrinking resources. Populist leaders emerge from both sides and pledge to take control and bring about order. That's when democracy is most challenged because it fails to control the anarchy. And it is when the move to a strong populist leader who will bring order to the chaos is most likely. As conflict within the country escalates, it leads to some form of revolution or civil war to redistribute wealth and force the necessary big changes. This can be peaceful and maintain the existing order, but it's more often violent and changes the order. For example, the Roosevelt Revolution to redistribute wealth was relatively peaceful and maintained the existing internal order, while the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution were much more violent and led to new internal orders. This internal conflict makes the empire weak and vulnerable to rising external rivals who, seeing this domestic weakness, are more inclined to mount a challenge. This raises the risk of great international conflict, especially if the rival has built up a comparable military. Defending oneself and one's empire against rivals requires great military spending, which has to occur as domestic economic conditions are deteriorating and the empire can least afford it. Since there is no viable system for peacefully adjudicating international disputes, these conflicts are typically resolved through tests of power. As bolder challenges are made, the leading empire is faced with the difficult choice of fighting or retreating. Fighting and losing is the worst outcome, but retreating is bad too, as it cedes progress to the rival and signals that the empire is weak to those countries that are considering which side to be on. Poor economic conditions cause more fighting for wealth and power, which inevitably leads to some kind of war. Wars are terribly costly. At the same time, they produce the tectonic shifts that realign the new waters to the new realities of wealth and power in the world. When those holding the reserve currency and debt of the declining empire lose faith and sell them, that marks the end of its big cycle. Of the roughly 750 currencies that existed since 1700, less than 20% now exist, and all of them have been devalued. For the Dutch, this happened after their defeat in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, when they weren't able to repay the massive debts they built up during it. This led to a run on the Bank of Amsterdam and a desperate sell-off, forcing massive money printing, which devalued the currency and the empire into irrelevance. For the British, this happened after World War II, when despite their victory, they could not repay the massive debts they borrowed to fund their war effort. This led to a series of money printing, devaluations, and sell-offs in the British pound as the US and the dollar emerged dominant and created a new world order. At the time of this recording, the United States hasn't yet reached this point. While it has massive debt, spends more than it earns, and funds this deficit with more borrowing and printing huge amounts of new money, the big sell-off in dollars and dollar debt hasn't yet begun. And while there are great internal and external conflicts occurring for all the classic reasons, they've not yet crossed the line to become wars. Eventually, out of these conflicts, whether they're violent or not, come new winners who get together and restructure the losers' debts and political systems and establish the new world order. Then, the old cycle and empire ends, and the new one begins, and they do it all over again. That's a lot of detail I just threw at you to paint a picture of how the typical big cycle transpires. Of course, not all of them transpire in exactly this way, but most largely do, so much so that it seems like the stories of rises and declines stay essentially the same, and the only things that change are the clothes the characters wear and the technologies they use. So, where are we heading? It's most often the case that a nation's greatest war is with itself, over whether or not it can make the hard decisions needed to sustain success. As for what we need to do, it comes down to just two things: earn more than we spend and treat each other well. All other things I mentioned, strong education, inventiveness, being competitive, and all the rest, are just ways of getting at these two things. It's easy to measure if we're doing them. So like people who want to get fit, let's get on the program and improve our vitals. Let's do that individually and collectively. My goal for sharing this picture of how the world works and a few principles for dealing with is to help you recognize where we are and the challenges we face, and to make the wise decisions needed to navigate these times well.
Are we, in your judgment, in a moment in which the world order is going to change?
Yes, we're changing the world order, okay? In 1945, we started the New World Order. What I mean is, throughout history, there's a fight. There's a fight for power. So there's a war, and then the winners come out of that war, and the winners set the rules. 1945, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money at the time. It had half the world's GDP. It had a monopoly on military power. So the U.S. set the world order. That's why the United Nations is in New York. Washington, D.C. has the IMF and the World Bank.
And its currency became the reserve currency.
And its currency became the reserve currency because of that set of circumstances. Things evolve. Things change, okay, over history. So the three big things that are changing now that haven't occurred in our lifetime is the amount of debt and money creation.
Large debt means the printing of money.
Right. The large debt puts central bankers in a choice. Do you pay it back with hard money, or do you pay it back with printed devalued money? And if you pay it back with hard money, it's hard. In other words, that's when you have debt crises. So in all cases, they eventually print money, and that produces inflation, right? So that dynamic's the first.
And that's the place we are at this moment.
That's the place we are at this moment.
Okay.
The second is when there's a great internal conflict, usually when there's a large wealth and values gap, and at the same time as you have a financial problem. Then you get populism of the left and populism of the right. In other words, those who feel disenfranchised want people who are going to fight for them. They don't want compromisers. They don't want them to be in the middle, because middle means that they're not fighting for them. They want them to have guts. So that you have populists of the left and populists
and
of
their
the
positions
right.
harden.
And their positions harden, and there are no compromises. That's why we're potentially in a situation that you could see in one of these elections, maybe in 2024, that neither side would accept losing. Perhaps we see that. You see, maybe you don't follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. So these things have not happened in our lifetime, but they happened many times in history. So if you look at that, you see from those patterns why the gaps become greater and the positions harden, and you see the dynamic. So that's the second. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power. In other words, I gave you the example of how the United States was so dominant in 1945. Now it's not as dominant. It is not dominant. In other words, China and the opposition is as strong as the United States and its allies. And so we have a conflict. And there are 5 kinds of wars. And they start in this order, just sequentially, typically. A trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war. Then you get into a capital and economic warfare, which we are now with sanctions. They always happened in history. And then there's a military war. And so you could see that progression happen through time. And that creates a template. So I like to look at the template and then plot dots to see how we're transpiring relative to that template.
미국 등 서방 국가들과 각을 세우고 있는 중국, 러시아가 인도, 중국, 남아프리카 공화국을 대상으로 동조 세력 확보에 나섰습니다.
미국 바이든 행정부가 러시아 군과 방산업계를 지원했다는 이유로 중국 기업 5곳을 제재 대상에 올렸습니다.
유럽의 다국적 회사인 에어버스가 중국 항공사들로부터 항공기 292대를 한꺼번에 주문받았습니다. 항공사의 경영적 판단이라기보다는 중국 당국의 정치적 결정에 따른 몰아주기식 구매로 보입니다.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes,
You are.
that's a commitment we made.